Elderly man gives his last meal to a stranger, and minutes later, receives a life-changing surprise. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. The early morning light filtered through the thin, faded curtains of John's small apartment, casting a soft glow that did little to lift the heavy shadows clinging to the corners of the room. The walls, once painted a bright, cheerful yellow by his late wife, Margaret, had dulled over the years, now streaked with lines of wear and memories that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the place. A single ceiling fan creaked lazily above, its blades turning slowly, barely stirring the stagnant air that carried a faint hint of the lavender scent Margaret had always loved. John lay motionless in his bed, the quilt pulled up to his chin, the fabric worn thin from years of use. He listened to the distant hum of the city outside, the honking of taxis, the muffled voices of early morning commuters, the occasional bark of a dog, all blending together into a low murmur that felt more like background noise than a connection to the world beyond his four walls. The bustling city, once a place of excitement and possibility for him and Margaret, now felt alien, like a foreign land he no longer had the energy or desire to explore. His gaze slowly drifted to the nightstand beside him, where a small, worn frame held the photograph of him and Margaret on their wedding day. They were so young, so full of dreams, standing on the steps of the old church that had since been replaced by a modern glass structure. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing lightly against the glass, as if trying to reach through time, to pull that moment back into reality. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, his voice cracking with age and emotion. The words hung in the air, unanswered, echoing only in his heart where the ache of her absence pulsed steadily. John sighed deeply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of a sadness that had become all too familiar. The mornings were always the hardest. Waking up alone in a bed that once held two, facing a day that held nothing but the same monotonous routine, made the emptiness inside him swell until it felt like it would swallow him whole. The loneliness was palpable, a constant presence that lingered in every corner of the apartment, from the quiet kitchen where they used to have breakfast together, to the worn armchair by the window where they had spent countless evenings watching the world go by. Slowly, he pushed back the quilt and swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor with a slight shiver. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, his head bowed as if the act of rising took more effort than he could muster. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder in the silence, each tick a reminder that time was moving forward, even if he felt frozen in place. "Another day, John," he muttered to himself, the sound of his own voice breaking the silence like a fragile thread. He forced himself to stand, his body protesting with the creaks and groans that came with age. His joints ached, the remnants of old injuries and the passage of time, but he ignored them as best he could, moving slowly towards the bathroom. The bathroom was small, barely enough room to turn around, but it was clean and orderly, just as Margaret had kept it. He caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror as he shuffled in, his reflection almost startling. The man staring back at him was a stranger, with deep lines etched into his face, his once vibrant blue eyes now dull and weary. His white hair, thin and sparse, stood up in uneven tufts, and his skin, pale and sallow, clung to his bones like a suit that no longer fit. John turned away from the mirror, not wanting to face the reality of his appearance. Instead, he focused on the simple tasks that had become his morning ritual: brushing his teeth, washing his face, combing what was left of his hair. Each action was methodical, performed with the same care he had always taken, even if it was now more out of habit than any real desire to look presentable. He dressed in silence, choosing the same worn flannel shirt and corduroy pants he wore most days. The shirt had been a gift from Margaret, one of the last she had given him before the illness took her, and despite its age, he couldn't bear to part with it. It was a small comfort, a piece of her that he could still hold on to, even as everything else seemed to slip away. As he made his way into the kitchen, the morning light had grown stronger, casting a warm glow over the room. The kitchen was simple, functional, with white cabinets and a small round table by the window. The table was set for one, a single cup and saucer, a spoon and a folded napkin, all neatly arranged as if waiting for someone who would never come. John paused by the table, his hand resting on the back of the chair that Margaret had always sat in. The chair was empty, of course, but in his mind, he could still see her there, smiling at him as she sipped her tea, her eyes sparkling with the love that had defined their lives together. "Good morning, Margaret," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The silence that followed was deafening, the emptiness of the room pressing in on him like a physical weight. He sat down slowly, placing his hands flat on the table, feeling the coolness of the wood beneath his palms. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring out the window at the city beyond, trying to summon the energy to start his day. But the truth was, every day felt the same now. The same empty routine, the same hollow feeling in his chest, the same memories playing over and over in his mind, like a film stuck on a loop. He knew he needed to eat, to keep up his strength, but the thought of preparing breakfast for one was almost too much to bear. It had been easier when Margaret was there, when they had shared these simple moments together, but now it all seemed pointless, just going through the motions of a life that had lost its meaning. Yet even as the weight of his grief threatened to pull him under, John knew he had to keep going. Margaret had always been the strong one, the one who had kept him grounded, even in the darkest of times. And though she was gone, he could still hear her voice in his head, urging him to keep moving forward, to live the life they had built together, even if it was now just him alone. So with a deep breath, he stood up, pulling himself away from the memories that clung to the edges of his mind like shadows. There was a day to face, and he would face it, just as he had faced every other day since Margaret had passed. One step at a time, one breath at a time, he would keep going, because that's what she would have wanted. And in that simple act of moving forward, he found a small measure of comfort, a connection to the woman he had loved so deeply and who had loved him in return. John stood by the small wooden table in his kitchen, staring down at the old coffee can where he kept his savings. The can was a relic from better times, its faded label barely legible after years of handling. He slowly lifted the lid, peering inside at the meager handful of crumpled bills and loose change. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached in, counting out the few remaining dollars. The coins clinked softly against each other, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen like the ticking of a clock, each chime a reminder of how little he had left. The bills, worn thin and soft from years of circulation, felt almost insubstantial between his fingers. John straightened them out carefully, smoothing the creases as if that small act could somehow make them worth more. It wasn't much, just enough for a simple meal, nothing more. He had been stretching his pension as far as it would go, cutting corners wherever he could, but the rising costs of the city had finally caught up with him. The thought of bills piling up and groceries running low gnawed at the back of his mind. But today, just for today, he decided to push those worries aside. With a resigned sigh, he tucked the bills into his wallet, the leather cracked and worn from years of use, and scooped the coins into his pocket. The weight of them felt heavier than it should, as if each coin carried with it the burden of every difficult decision he had made in the past few months. He didn't have much, but he still had this, enough for one last decent meal at the cafe down the street. It wasn't just about the food, though. It was about the small comfort of familiar surroundings, the quiet hum of conversation, and the sense of normalcy it brought him, if only for a little while. John reached for his coat, an old woolen thing that had seen better days, and shrugged it on. The fabric was rough against his skin, worn thin at the elbows, but it still held the warmth he needed to brave the early autumn chill. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, Margaret's scarf, one she had knitted herself in shades of blue and gray that reminded him of winter skies. The scarf was frayed at the edges now, but it still carried her scent, faint but comforting, like a whisper of her presence. He took a moment to look around the small kitchen, the place where he and Margaret had shared so many meals, so many conversations. The space felt hollow now, the absence of her voice a constant aching silence. The breakfast table, with its single setting, seemed almost accusatory, a reminder of the life that had once been full and vibrant, now reduced to this solitary existence. John swallowed hard, pushing back the wave of loneliness that threatened to overtake him. Before leaving, he paused by the window, looking out at the busy street below. The sidewalks were already bustling with people hurrying to work, their faces set in determination, oblivious to the quiet struggles happening in the apartments above. The city was moving, always moving, while John felt like he was standing still, left behind by the relentless march of time. But he had no choice but to keep going, to face each day as it came, even if the days felt increasingly empty. Taking a deep breath, John turned away from the window and made his way to the door. The apartment felt colder in his absence, the air thick with the memories he left behind. He locked the door with a sense of finality, the click of the latch echoing in the hallway like a distant farewell. As he descended the stairs, the familiar creak of each step beneath his feet was a small comfort, a reminder that some things, at least, remained unchanged. John stepped out into the brisk morning air, pulling his coat tighter around him as he made his way down the street. The cafe wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but the walk felt longer today, each step heavier with the weight of his thoughts. He passed the familiar landmarks, the small grocery store where he and Margaret used to shop, the park where they had spent countless afternoons together, the library where she had volunteered. Each place was a reminder of a life that had once been rich with love and companionship, now reduced to a series of fading memories. As he neared the cafe, the warm glow of its windows beckoned to him, a small haven in the midst of the city's chaos. John could already imagine the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the clink of dishes, and the hum of conversation that awaited him inside. It was a small thing, this visit to the cafe, but it was something. A brief respite from the loneliness, a chance to feel like a part of the world again, if only for a little while. The streets of New York were already teeming with life as John made his way down the familiar path to the cafe. The crisp morning air bit at his cheeks, and he pulled his coat tighter around him, the wool offering some solace against the cold. His breath came out in small visible puffs, dissipating quickly into the atmosphere as he walked with measured, deliberate steps. The city moved around him with its usual chaos, people rushing by, cars honking, the distant rumble of the subway beneath his feet. Yet, despite the noise, John felt an eerie quiet within himself, a silence that had settled in ever since Margaret had passed. As he rounded the corner onto a quieter side street, something unusual caught his attention. There, huddled against the brick wall of an old building, sat a young man. His clothes were worn and tattered, his hair disheveled and dirty. He looked far too thin, the kind of thinness that comes from too many days without a proper meal. The man's eyes were downcast, fixed on the cracked pavement beneath him, but there was a deep sadness in them, as if he had long since stopped expecting anything from the world around him. John slowed his pace as he approached, his heart tightening in his chest. The sight of the young man stirred something in him. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in the way the man sat, arms wrapped around his knees for warmth, or the faint glimmer of desperation in his hollow gaze. Whatever it was, John felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to stop, to look closer. The young man, sensing someone nearby, lifted his head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. For a brief moment, the bustling city seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them standing in that quiet, empty space between strangers. John could see the weariness etched into the man's features, the kind of weariness that comes from more than just lack of sleep. It was the weariness of someone who had been beaten down by life, who had seen too much, lost too much, and was now teetering on the edge of giving up. There was something familiar in that look, something that resonated with John on a deep, almost primal level. He had seen that same expression in the mirror many times since Margaret had died, the same sense of hopelessness that threatened to consume him every morning when he woke up alone. And yet, there was also a flicker of something else in the young man's eyes, something that John recognized as the faintest spark of humanity, a spark that had not yet been completely extinguished. The young man's clothes were barely adequate for the weather, an old threadbare jacket that hung loosely on his frail frame, torn jeans, and shoes that were more holes than leather. His hands, chapped and red from the cold, were tucked under his arms in a vain attempt to keep warm. Beside him on the ground was a small dirty blanket, the kind given out at shelters, and a cardboard sign with the words, "Hungry and Homeless," scrawled across it in shaky, uneven handwriting. John stopped a few feet away, his eyes lingering on the sign. The simple words struck him with an unexpected force, pulling him out of his own thoughts and grounding him in the present moment. He had seen homeless people before, of course. They were a common sight in the city. But something about this young man felt different. Maybe it was the way he didn't actively beg for money, or the way he kept his head down, as if too ashamed to look anyone in the eye. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which he endured the harshness of his reality, not asking for pity, just trying to survive another day. The young man glanced up at John, his eyes filled with a quiet resignation, as if he had already prepared himself for the usual indifference or disdain he often received from passers-by. But John didn't walk past. Instead, he stood there, feeling an odd mix of emotions. Pity, yes, but also something deeper, a sense of shared suffering that bridged the gap between them. It was as if, in that moment, John saw not just a homeless stranger, but a reflection of his own struggles, his own loneliness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued to move around them, a blur of motion and noise that seemed far removed from the stillness that had settled between them. John felt a lump form in his throat, an emotion he couldn't quite name as he looked at the young man. There was a part of him that wanted to turn away, to continue on to the cafe and lose himself in the comfort of routine. But there was another part, a stronger, more insistent part, that compelled him to stay, to acknowledge the silent plea in the young man's eyes. The young man lowered his gaze again, as if ashamed of being seen in such a vulnerable state. John noticed the slight tremble in his hands, the way his shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make himself as small as possible, to disappear from the world that had forgotten him. And in that moment, John felt a stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a desire to reach out, to connect, to do something that mattered, if only for a moment. John's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant church bell chiming the hour, reminding him of the time. But the cafe, the meal he had planned, suddenly seemed less important. There was something far more pressing in front of him, a choice that he knew, deep down, would change the course of his day, perhaps even more. John stood there for what felt like an eternity, the noise of the city fading into the background as he focused on the young man before him. The weight of his own struggles, his own loss, seemed to mingle with the palpable despair radiating from Michael. John's mind flashed back to his younger days, when he had fought in a war where survival depended not just on one's own strength, but also on the kindness of others. He remembered the countless times he'd been offered a hand, a small act of generosity that had made all the difference. And now, as he looked at this young man, he knew in his heart that it was his turn to extend that hand. Without another thought, John reached into his pocket and felt the rough edges of the bills and coins he had counted so carefully just moments before. It wasn't much, barely enough for one meal, but it was all he had. The thought of parting with his last bit of money gave him pause, but only for a moment. Margaret's voice, gentle and encouraging, seemed to whisper in his ear, reminding him of the man he'd always tried to be, the man she had loved, the man who believed in helping others, even when it was difficult. John took a slow breath, steeling himself, and then took a step closer to Michael. The young man looked up at him, confusion flickering in his tired eyes as John extended his hand, not with money, but with an offer far more significant. "Come with me," John said softly, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion that threatened to break through. "Let me buy you something to eat." But there was nothing but sincerity in John's expression, and slowly, cautiously, Michael reached out and took his hand. The touch was brief, just a light clasping of hands before they both let go. But in that moment, something shifted. John felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. It was as if, by offering this small act of kindness, he had rekindled a part of himself that had lain dormant since Margaret's passing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. "Thank you," Michael mumbled, his voice rough from disuse, his gaze dropping back to the ground. There was a vulnerability in his tone that struck John deeply, a reminder of how fragile the human spirit could be when battered by life's hardships. John nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "No need to thank me," he replied, trying to keep his tone light, though he couldn't completely mask the emotion in his voice. "Let's just get you something warm to eat." Michael followed, his steps hesitant at first, as if unsure whether he truly belonged beside this kind stranger. But as they walked side by side, there was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of suffering and the simple, profound act of kindness that had brought them together. The cold wind whipped around them as they moved through the streets, but John hardly felt it. His mind was focused on the task ahead, on the meal they would share, on the small comfort he could provide. It wasn't much, but it was something that, in that moment, felt more important than anything else in the world. As they approached the cafe, John glanced over at Michael, noting the way his shoulders had relaxed slightly, the way his steps had become more sure. There was still a long way to go, Still so much pain and uncertainty ahead, but for now there was this: a warm meal, a moment of connection, a small act of generosity that could make all the difference. And so, with a deep sense of resolve, John opened the door to the cafe, holding it wide as Michael stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe enveloped them both, a stark contrast to the chill outside, and for the first time in a long while, John felt a flicker of hope. The warmth of the cafe was a stark contrast to the cold outside, and as John and Michael settled into a small booth near the window, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, approached their table and took their order without a second glance at Michael's disheveled appearance. It was clear that the cafe was a place where everyone was welcome, no matter their circumstances. John ordered a hearty breakfast for both of them: pancakes, eggs, bacon, and steaming mugs of coffee. It was more food than he had eaten in weeks, but the idea of sharing a warm meal with Michael brought him a sense of comfort that he hadn't felt in a long time. As they waited for the food to arrive, there was a brief, comfortable silence between them, broken only by the occasional clink of dishes or the murmur of conversations from other patrons. When the food was finally set before them, Michael hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether he should really dig in. John, noticing the hesitation, offered a gentle nod of encouragement. "Go on, eat," he said softly. "It's good to have something warm in your stomach." As he began to eat, his movements were slow at first, almost cautious, as though he were savoring each bite. But soon hunger took over, and he ate with more urgency, clearly ravenous after who knew how long without a proper meal. John watched him, a pang of sympathy in his chest, but also a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had done the right thing. As the meal progressed, the initial silence between them gave way to conversation, each man gradually opening up, their words flowing more freely with each bite. It began with small talk. John asked Michael where he was from, and Michael in turn asked how long John had lived in the city. But as they spoke, it became clear that there was more beneath the surface, stories that needed to be told, burdens that needed to be shared. John was the first to speak of his past, his voice steady, but tinged with the weight of memories. He spoke of his time in the military, of the friends he had lost and the battles that had left scars both visible and invisible. He talked about Margaret, how they had met in a small town in the Midwest, how she had been the light of his life, and how, after the war, they had moved to New York to start fresh. His voice softened as he described their life together, the laughter, the love, the small moments of joy that had defined their years. But when he spoke of her passing, his voice faltered, the pain of her loss still as raw as it had been on the day she died. Michael listened intently, his food momentarily forgotten as he absorbed John's words. There was a deep understanding in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the grief that came with losing someone you loved. And when John finished, Michael took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to share his own story. He began hesitantly, his voice low and rough, as though the words themselves were painful to speak. Michael spoke of a childhood marred by poverty and neglect, of a mother who had tried her best but had been overwhelmed by life's hardships. He talked about how he had left home at a young age, determined to make something of himself, only to find that the world was far harsher than he had imagined. He had worked odd jobs, lived in shelters, and done whatever he could to survive. But it had never been enough. The streets had taken their toll on him, both physically and mentally, until he had reached a point where he felt utterly lost. As Michael spoke, John could see the years of hardship etched into his face, in the lines around his eyes, in the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing against an invisible weight. But there was something else too, a resilience, a strength that had kept Michael going despite everything. And as Michael continued, John found himself drawn to this young man, not just out of pity, but out of a genuine respect for the battles he had fought, the battles he was still fighting. Their stories, though different in many ways, shared common threads: loss, struggle, and the search for meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent. They both knew what it was like to carry the weight of grief, to wake up each day with a void that nothing could fill. And yet, here they were, sharing a meal, finding solace in each other's company, if only for a moment. The conversation flowed easily now, each man finding comfort in the other's presence. They spoke of the past, of the moments that had shaped them, but also of the present, of the small victories that kept them going. For John, It was the memory of Margaret's smile, the knowledge that she would have wanted him to keep living, to find some semblance of peace. For Michael, it was the simple fact that he was still here, still breathing, still fighting to survive despite everything that had been thrown at him. As the plates emptied and the coffee cups grew cold, the conversation began to wind down, the two men lapsing into a comfortable silence once more, but this time the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two people who had shared something real, something meaningful. They had opened their hearts, if only a little, and in doing so, had found a connection that neither of them had expected. The world outside the cafe continued to move, the city's rhythm unchanged by the small, quiet moment they had shared. But for John and Michael, that moment had made all the difference. They had found, in each other, a kindred spirit, someone who understood the pain of loss and the struggle to keep going. And as they sat there, the remnants of their meal before them, they both knew that this simple act of sharing, a meal, a story, a moment, had changed something within them. The last of the plates had been cleared away, and the two men sat in a moment of quiet contentment, the warmth of the cafe enveloping them like a protective cocoon against the cold world outside. The conversation had dwindled, not from awkwardness, but from a shared sense of completion, as if everything that needed to be said had been said. The waitress, who had been kind enough not to hurry them along, returned with the check, placing it gently on the table between them. John reached for it without hesitation, his hand steady as he laid down the few bills that had remained in his wallet. He knew that this was all he had, but the decision to spend it here, in this moment, felt right. There was a calm certainty in his actions, a quiet affirmation that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Michael looked at the check, then at John, his eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For a man who had grown accustomed to being overlooked, ignored, and sometimes even feared, this act of kindness was almost overwhelming. He opened his mouth to protest, to insist that John didn't need to do this, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he found himself simply nodding, accepting the gift for what it was, an offering of compassion from one human being to another. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, but the sincerity in it was undeniable. His eyes, once hollow and distant, now shone with something that had been missing for far too long: hope. He knew this meal would not change his circumstances, would not erase the hardships he had endured, but it had given him something far more valuable, a reminder that he was still seen, still cared for, still worthy of kindness. John smiled, a small, gentle curve of his lips that spoke volumes. "You're welcome, Michael," he replied softly, his voice warm and steady. "Take care of yourself, okay?" He wasn't used to goodbyes that felt this meaningful, wasn't used to parting ways with someone who had shown him such unexpected kindness, but he knew he couldn't linger, couldn't hold on to this moment forever, no matter how much he might want to. "Take care of yourself too, John," Michael said, his voice a bit stronger now, though still tinged with emotion. He reached out, offering his hand, and John took it without hesitation. The handshake was firm, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they had forged in this brief span of time. It was a gesture that said more than words could. "Thank you. I won't forget this, I'll carry this with me." As their hands parted, Michael took a step back, his gaze lingering on John's face for a moment longer before he turned to leave. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as he pushed it open, the cold air rushing in to greet him as he stepped out onto the street. John watched him go, his figure quickly blending into the crowd of morning commuters, until he was just another face in the sea of humanity. For a long moment, John remained seated, his eyes still fixed on the door through which Michael had disappeared. The cafe around him buzzed with life, waitresses moving from table to table, customers chatting over their meals, the hiss of the coffee machine in the background. But John was lost in his thoughts, the world around him fading into the periphery. A deep sense of peace settled over him, a warmth that began in his chest and radiated outward, filling him with a quiet satisfaction. He had given what little he had, but in return, he had gained something far more valuable. The simple act of sharing a meal, of listening to another story, had rekindled a spark within him that he hadn't realized had dimmed. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of his own loneliness, he could still make a difference, still touch someone else's life in a meaningful way. With a soft sigh, John finally rose from the booth, his movement slow and deliberate. He reached for his coat, the familiar weight of it settling around his shoulders as he shrugged it on. The cafe had been a haven, a brief respite from the cold reality outside, but he knew it was time to leave, to return to the world beyond these walls. As he made his way to the door, he glanced around the cafe one last time, taking in the warmth and light, the simple comfort of this place. Then, with a final nod to the waitress who had served them, he stepped outside, the chill of the morning air wrapping around him once more. But this time, it didn't feel quite so cold. The cold wind nipped at John's face as he made his way back to his apartment, his coat pulled tightly around him. The streets, now busier with the flow of the morning rush, felt different, less daunting, more alive. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the cafe, to the meal he had shared with Michael, and to the profound impact the encounter had left on him. Each step echoed in his mind, the sound mingling with the distant hum of the city. He couldn't help but replay their conversation, each word carrying a weight he hadn't felt in years. It was rare to find such raw honesty, such vulnerability in the brief connections we make with others. Yet, in that short time, John had felt something shift within him, a quiet reminder that, despite the losses and the hardships, he still had the capacity to care, to make a difference, no matter how small. The closer he got to his building, the more the reality of his own situation began to press down on him. He had given Michael his last few dollars, and while he didn't regret it for a second, the uncertainty of what came next loomed large in his mind. His savings were nearly depleted, and the bills were piling up. The apartment that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a cage, the walls closing in as the weight of his financial troubles bore down on him. Yet, despite the worry gnawing at the back of his mind, there was a calmness within him, a deep-seated peace that came from knowing he had done the right thing. Margaret had always told him that kindness was never wasted, that the good we put into the world had a way of coming back to us when we least expected it. He clung to that belief now, even as doubts tried to creep in. The building came into view, its old brick facade worn from years of weather and wear. John climbed the steps slowly, his legs heavy, not just from the physical exertion but from the weight of his thoughts. The familiar creak of the stairwell greeted him as he made his way up to his floor, each step taking him closer to the solitude of his apartment. When he reached his door, he paused, his hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of reluctance to step back into the silence that awaited him. The apartment, once filled with the warmth and laughter of a shared life, had become a stark reminder of everything he had lost. But it was home, his home, and for better or worse, it was where he belonged. He turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, the familiar scent of the old wood and faint lavender greeting him as he stepped inside. The air was still, almost too quiet, as if the apartment itself had been waiting for his return. He set his coat on the worn hook by the door, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to delay the inevitable return to routine. John wandered into the small living room, his eyes falling on the framed photos that adorned the walls. There was Margaret, smiling back at him from behind the glass, her eyes full of the life and love that had once filled these rooms. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the frame, as if trying to draw strength from her memory. "I did what you would have done, Margaret," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound of his own voice in the empty room only emphasized the loneliness that had become his constant companion. But even in that loneliness, there was a sense of fulfillment, of having honored her memory by following the example she had set. He moved to the small kitchen, the place that had once been the heart of their home. The table was as he had left it, set for one, a simple reminder of the life he now led. He didn't feel hungry. How could he, after the meal he had just shared? But the routine of making tea, of filling the kettle and waiting for it to boil, offered a semblance of normalcy in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. As the kettle whistled, John poured the steaming water into his favorite mug, the one Margaret had given him years ago. He carried the mug to the window, where he stood watching the world go by outside. The city was alive with movement, with people going about their lives, each with their own stories, their own struggles. And yet, in that moment, John felt a connection to it all, a reminder that he was still part of something larger, still capable of making a difference, even in the smallest of ways. He sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through him, easing the tension in his shoulders. There was still much to worry about, much that remained unresolved, But for now he allowed himself to simply be, grateful for the brief respite, for the act of kindness that had brought him here, and for the quiet peace that settled over him as he stood in the fading light of the morning. The quiet of John's apartment was suddenly interrupted by a soft but firm knock on the door. It was unexpected, almost startling, as visitors were a rarity for John these days. He set his half-empty mug of tea on the windowsill, his brow furrowing slightly in curiosity and a touch of apprehension. The knock came again, more insistent this time, urging him to respond. John moved towards the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking floorboards. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it a neighbor, perhaps? Or maybe the landlord, though he couldn't recall having missed any payments. His heart beat a little faster, a mix of nerves and intrigue, as he reached for the doorknob. As he opened the door, John was met with the sight of a man standing in the dimly lit hallway. The man was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his shoes polished to a high shine. His appearance was strikingly out of place in the worn-down building, and for a moment, John wondered if he had somehow stepped into the wrong apartment. The man offered a polite, practiced smile, his eyes steady and composed behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. He exuded an air of quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of dealing with important matters. There was a brief pause as the two men sized each other up, John, with his slightly disheveled appearance and worn flannel shirt, and the stranger, with his crisp, professional demeanor. "Mr. John?" the man asked, his voice smooth and respectful, though there was a hint of formality in his tone, as if he were accustomed to addressing clients in high-stakes situations. He adjusted the briefcase he held at his side, the leather gleaming in the soft light that filtered into the hallway. John nodded slowly, his curiosity deepening. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice cautious but polite. He couldn't help but wonder what business this well-dressed stranger could possibly have with him. The man extended his hand in greeting, his grip firm and assured. "My name is David. I'm an attorney, and I've been trying to get in touch with you regarding an important matter." He couldn't recall any legal issues or disputes that would require an attorney's attention, and the unexpected nature of the visit left him momentarily off balance. David nodded, his expression remaining calm and professional. "Yes, Mr. John, I apologize for the unannounced visit, but I needed to speak with you directly. May I come in?" Nevertheless, his innate sense of hospitality won out, and he stepped aside, gesturing for David to enter. "Of course, come in," John said, his voice steadying as he motioned toward the modest living room. "It's not much, but please have a seat." He took a seat on the aging couch, setting his briefcase carefully on the coffee table in front of him. John followed, his mind still buzzing with questions. He sat down in his usual chair, the one Margaret used to tease him about for being too worn out. The familiarity of the chair provided a small comfort as he tried to make sense of the situation. David cleared his throat, his demeanor remaining composed as he began to speak. "Mr. John, I'm here regarding a matter of some significance. I'll explain everything in detail, but first, I want to assure you that there is no cause for alarm." The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the revelation that was about to come. David paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, before continuing. "I've come to deliver some news that I believe will be of great importance to you." The moment felt suspended in time, the air heavy with anticipation, as he waited for the man before him to reveal the reason behind his unexpected visit. David took a moment to compose his thoughts, carefully unfastening the clasps of his leather briefcase and retrieving a manila envelope from within. He placed it gently on the coffee table between them, his movements deliberate, almost reverent, as though he understood the gravity of the news he was about to deliver. "Mr. John," David began, his tone respectful and measured, "I'm here on behalf of a former comrade of yours, a man named Robert Hayes. I believe you knew him well during your time in the service." Robert Hayes had been more than just a fellow soldier. He had been a brother in arms, someone John had fought alongside in some of the darkest days of the war. They had shared a bond forged in the crucible of battle, one that had endured long after the fighting had ended. But over the years, as life took them in different directions, they had lost touch. The news of Robert's passing, delivered so unexpectedly, hit John like a blow he hadn't seen coming. David continued, his voice gentle as he recounted the details. Mr. Hayes passed away a few months ago. He had no immediate family, no children or close relatives to speak of. But before he died, he made it clear that there was one person he wanted to remember, one person who had made a lasting impact on his life. He remembered Robert as a man of quiet strength, someone who had never sought recognition for his actions, but who had always been there when it mattered most. The two of them had faced impossible odds together, had seen things no one should ever have to see, and had survived by relying on each other's courage and resolve. David opened the envelope carefully, withdrawing a set of neatly folded documents. He placed them on the table in front of John, his expression serious but kind. Mr. Hayes wanted to ensure that his gratitude for your friendship and bravery was expressed in a meaningful way. In his will, he named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. It's not just a token sum, it's a considerable inheritance, one that reflects the depth of his appreciation for what you did for him during the war. The room seemed to close in around him, the familiar surroundings of his apartment blurring slightly as the reality of the situation took hold. Robert, who had always been so unassuming, had left behind a legacy that now belonged to John. David pushed the documents a little closer to John, his voice calm and reassuring. The estate includes a substantial financial sum, as well as property and other assets. Mr. Hayes was a man of modest means, but he made wise investments over the years, and he wanted to ensure that those he cared about were taken care of after he was gone. For John, the inheritance was not just an unexpected windfall. It was a symbol of the respect and gratitude of a man who had never forgotten the kindness and courage of a friend. David paused, allowing John a moment to process the information before he continued. The room was filled with a heavy silence, one that spoke to the profound impact of the news that had just been delivered. The documents lay on the table, untouched, waiting for John to take the next step, to accept the gift that Robert had left for him, a gift born out of a deep and abiding sense of gratitude and friendship. John stared at the documents on the table, the words blurring slightly as a rush of emotions swept over him. The news of Robert's death hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated, a deep, aching sorrow that came from losing a friend he had long held dear in his heart. They had drifted apart over the years, as often happens with the passage of time, but the bond they had shared was unbreakable, forged in the fires of war, and tempered by the quiet moments of camaraderie that only those who have faced death together can understand. For a moment, John couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt slightly, his vision narrowing as he tried to process the enormity of what David had just told him. Robert was gone, another piece of his past, another thread in the tapestry of his life that had frayed and snapped. The grief was immediate and profound, a sharp pain that settled deep in his chest. He thought of the younger man he had once known, the way Robert had always managed to keep a level head even in the most dire situations, the quiet strength he had brought to their unit, the sacrifices he had made without hesitation. And now, all that remained was a memory and the legacy he had left behind. But beneath the sorrow, there was something else, an unexpected flicker of hope that began to take root in the depths of John's heart. It was a strange and confusing sensation, this mingling of grief and hope, as if the universe had decided to balance the scales of his life in some inscrutable way. The inheritance was a gift, yes, but it was also a responsibility, a sign that Robert had believed in him, even after all these years, even after life had taken them down different paths. It was as if Robert were reaching out from beyond the grave, reminding John that he still had a purpose, that there was still something to live for. John's hands trembled as he reached for the documents, the paper cool and crisp against his fingertips. His eyes skimmed over the legal jargon, the numbers and figures that represented a future he hadn't dared to imagine. It was more than he could have ever expected, more than he had ever thought possible at this stage in his life. The financial security, the property, the assets, it was all overwhelming, a sudden shift in his reality that left him reeling. But it wasn't just the material wealth that moved him. It was the thought that Robert had remembered him, had valued their friendship so deeply that he had chosen to leave this legacy in his care. It was a final, silent acknowledgement of the bond they had shared, a testament to the trust and respect that had never wavered, even as the years rolled by. In that moment, John felt an almost unbearable mix of emotions: gratitude, sorrow, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose, all swirling together in a maelstrom that left him breathless. David, sensing the emotional turmoil John was experiencing, remained silent, giving him the space he needed to absorb the magnitude of the situation. The room seemed to hum with a quiet energy, the air thick with unspoken thoughts and feelings. John's mind raced with memories of Robert, of the times they had shared, the laughs, the hardships, the victories, and the losses. And now, this final act of generosity, a parting gift that carried with it the weight of a lifetime of experiences. As the initial shock began to wear off, John found himself grappling with a strange sense of possibility. The inheritance represented more than just financial stability. It was a chance for a new beginning, a way to honor Robert's memory by making something meaningful out of the life he had left. It was as if a door had been opened, revealing a path he hadn't seen before, one that led to a future he had stopped believing in. The sadness was still there, deep and pervasive, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve, a determination to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. John slowly set the documents back on the table, his hands still trembling slightly, and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as he tried to steady himself, to find his footing in this new reality. The grief would take time to process, and the weight of Robert's loss would never fully leave him. But beneath it all, there was the spark of something new, something that felt like the beginning of a second chance. The morning light had shifted to a softer golden hue as the day wore on, casting long shadows across the city streets. John stood by the window, the document still resting on the table behind him, his mind churning with thoughts of Robert and the profound gift he had received. The overwhelming emotions that had washed over him earlier had begun to settle into a deeper resolve, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He knew he couldn't let this opportunity pass by. Robert's final act of generosity had given him a chance not only to secure his own future, but to reach out and help others in need, just as he had been helped, just as Robert had done for him in the past. His thoughts kept circling back to Michael, the young man he had met earlier that day, whose eyes had reflected a similar sense of despair and hopelessness that John had once known all too well. Without another thought, John grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and made his way outside. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant hum of the city. He moved with a purpose now, his footsteps sure and determined as he retraced the path he had walked that morning. The streets were busier now, filled with people going about their day, but John's focus was unwavering. He had to find Michael. He had to do something meaningful with the gift he had been given. John walked through the familiar streets, his eyes scanning every corner, every alleyway, searching for the young man who had left such an impression on him. He passed the cafe where they had shared breakfast, the warmth of that moment still lingering in his memory. But Michael was nowhere to be seen. Undeterred, John continued his search, determined to find the man who had touched his heart in a way that few others had. As he walked, John's mind replayed the conversation they had shared, the stories of hardship and loss that had bonded them, even if just for a brief time. He thought of the look in Michael's eyes, the flicker of hope that had appeared when John had reached out to him, offering more than just a meal, offering a connection, a reminder that he wasn't alone in the world. That connection was something John knew he had to nurture, to turn into something lasting and real. Hours seemed to pass as John wandered the streets, his determination unwavering, even as the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. The city around him was alive with activity, but John's world had narrowed to a single focus: finding Michael. He asked passers-by if they had seen a young man matching Michael's description, but the answers were vague, uncertain. The city was vast, and Michael could have gone anywhere, but John refused to give up. Finally, just as he was beginning to feel the first twinges of doubt, John spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench in a small park, tucked away from the main thoroughfare. Michael was there, huddled in his thin jacket, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him, as if lost in thought. The sight of him brought a surge of relief and determination to John's heart, and he quickened his pace, his breath coming in short, eager bursts as he approached. "Michael," John called out softly as he drew near, not wanting to startle him. The young man looked up, his expression one of surprise mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe even hope. John could see the weariness in his eyes, the same weariness that had been there earlier, but there was also a spark of something new, something that hadn't been there before. "John," Michael's voice was hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe that the older man had come back for him. John nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I've been looking for you," he said, his tone gentle but filled with a quiet resolve. "There's something I need to talk to you about." The two men sat there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background as they focused on each other. John could see the questions in Michael's eyes, the uncertainty mixed with a glimmer of hope that he had seen earlier. "I told you this morning that you're not alone," John began, his voice steady as he met Michael's gaze. "And I meant it. I know things have been hard for you, harder than they should be for anyone. But I've been given a chance to make a difference, to help someone who deserves it. And I want that someone to be you. Because I see something in you, Michael, something worth fighting for. You've been through so much, but you're still here, still trying. And that's worth something. I want to help you find a way out of this, to give you a chance at the life you deserve." He had found Michael, and now together, they would find a way to move forward, to take the gift that Robert had given and turn it into something that could change both their lives. The crisp autumn air swirled around John and Michael as they sat on the park bench, their conversation lingering in the space between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The city, with all its noise and chaos, seemed distant now, as if the world had shrunk to just the two of them and the possibilities that lay ahead. Michael's eyes, once filled with despair, now held a cautious hope, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could change. John felt that hope too, and it fueled a determination within him that he hadn't felt in years. Robert's gift had come to him at a time when he needed it most, and now it was clear to John that this wasn't just about him. It was about extending that gift to someone who needed it even more, someone like Michael, who had been left behind by a world that too often looked the other way. As they sat there, John began to outline his plan. It was simple, but it had the potential to make a profound difference. He wanted to use part of the inheritance to help Michael get back on his feet, find him a place to stay, get him into a job training program, maybe even help him reconnect with family if that was something Michael wanted. But more than that, John wanted to be there for Michael, to be a friend, a mentor, a steady presence in his life. He knew how important that kind of support could be, especially when the world seemed to be closing in around you. Michael listened intently, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as John spoke. He had been through so much, seen so much darkness, that the idea of someone caring enough to help him rebuild his life seemed almost too good to be true. But there was something in John's voice, in the sincerity of his words, that made Michael believe that this was real, that he wasn't dreaming. "You don't have to do this," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "You've already done so much. I don't want to be a burden. We all need a little help sometimes, and there's no shame in that. Besides, I think Robert would have wanted this too. He left me this gift so that I could make a difference, and I can't think of a better way to honor his memory." The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the park. The world around them continued on, unaware of the small but significant moment unfolding on that bench. Finally, Michael nodded, his resolve solidifying. "Okay," he said, his voice firmer now. "Okay, let's do this." But he also knew that with determination, support, and a bit of kindness, they could accomplish something truly remarkable. Over the next few weeks, John and Michael worked together to put their plan into action. John found a small but comfortable apartment for Michael, not far from his own, a place where he could begin to rebuild his life. They went shopping for clothes and essentials, things that would help Michael regain a sense of dignity and self-worth. John also connected Michael with a job training program that specialized in helping people who had fallen on hard times, giving him the tools he needed to build a sustainable future. But it wasn't just about the practicalities. John made sure to be there for Michael in other ways too. They met for coffee, shared meals, and talked about life, about the challenges they had faced and the hopes they held for the future. In time, their bond grew stronger, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to struggle and to persevere. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Michael began to flourish. He found a job through the training program, a modest start, but one that filled him with pride and purpose. He began to regain his confidence, his sense of self, and with John's support, He started to look forward to the future in a way he hadn't thought possible. John, too, found that his own life had taken on new meaning. The loss of Margaret still weighed heavily on him, as did the grief for Robert, but helping Michael had given him a renewed sense of purpose. It was as if by helping someone else find their way, he had found a way to heal some of the wounds in his own heart. Their lives weren't perfect. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and fear, but they faced them together, stronger for the bond they had forged. And in that bond, they found something that neither of them had expected, a reminder that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could transform lives in ways they had never imagined. As the seasons changed and time moved on, John and Michael continued to walk this new path together. Each step, a testament to the power of compassion, friendship, and the belief that no one is ever truly alone. The new chapter in their lives was just beginning, but already it was filled with hope, possibility, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had made a difference in each other's lives, and perhaps in the world around them as well.